Well, today I turned 30, and I was going to have you guess how old I am, but I was really worried about some of the answers we might get. Um, Always a little terrifying to do that. But today I turned 30, and I'm excited because I get right now to celebrate with y'all. And really, today is a day that I enjoy. I love Sundays, and I know I'm a pastor, and so that's kind of like a cliche thing to say, but I look forward to this day every week. And so I'm excited to celebrate with y'all. I'm excited because tonight I'm going to get together with some family, and we're going to grill out, and Dad's cooking steaks. And I think he knows that, but if not, he's running slides right now. So he just found out that tonight, Dad, you're cooking steaks. But then one of the best parts of any birthday, and I think we can all agree on this, right? Like, I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. I don't care where you are on any divide. One of the things that unites us is we can all agree birthday cake is like delicious, right? Everybody agree with me on that? Is that like the one? Maybe that's where peace is going to start in our society, right? After a certain age, this is what we look forward to in our birthdays, the chance to get together and eat cake. I don't know where the line is, but there's a certain point where you're like, can I just stop adding candles and just add me another slice of cake? Like, that's an option here. I'm excited for birthday cake. I know some of you love cake as well, partially because it's delicious, no doubt, but also because cakes become kind of a snapshot. They become a time capsule to a memory. And normally we eat cake at cherished memories. We eat cake at birthdays, and so you just turned 7 last week, you had a cake, right? Or like you got together with some friends and you had a good one, right? There we go, right? Cakes are fun for birthdays. Sometimes we eat cakes when we retire, and that's a celebration. And so Jan Hancock retired this last Friday, and I bet there was a cake to celebrate a good occasion. Sometimes we eat cakes for graduation. Sometimes we eat cakes for these different celebrations. Probably the biggest cake most of us will remember if this happens to us in our lives is wedding cakes, right? And that's like the big celebration where we look and it's a symbol of a moment where love is just all around the room, right? Cakes are awesome and they're fun and they're delicious, but more importantly, they take us to these moments that are enjoyable. Now, I have this belief that cakes are a snapshot, they're a time capsule, and therefore you can tell a lot about a person by a cake. So this last week, I got some help with my mom to find some birthday cakes from my own past, and I was hoping I could look through the photos first and find the non-embarrassing ones to share with you, and I think Mom knew I was going to do that, so she shared them, she group texted them, not just to me, but to others as well to make sure they got shared. So thanks, Mom. But here are some cakes, some time capsules of my own. So the first one, this is a cake from when I was 1. Yeah, that was the last time I was cute. But a couple of things, like you can tell at this age, 1, I like clowns. This is before I realized clowns were terrifying. There's clowns on this cake. And 2, you'll notice, like if you got really close to this photo, you could tell we're missing something on the table. There's absolutely no silverware inside. There is no fork to eat the cake because this is the last age at which it was appropriate to do what all of us, let's be honest, deep down think is right, and that's just grab a handful of food and shove it in your mouth, right? Like anybody still wish we could do that? You don't have to raise your hand. I know you're thinking it though. That was me at 1, and that was a time capsule into 1. Fast forward a couple years, this is 3-year-old me, and that's a Goofy cake, like Goofy, the kind of cartoon guy, right? And so I was really into Goofy at this point, and I think my favorite color was blue, and across from me, that's my cousin, and we're about to get into a fight over who has the most cake. Spoilers, I won. Fast forward another year, and here I am at 4, and there's a tiger on this cake because I was really into tigers. I was also really into bowl cuts and really into freakish amounts of eye contact. So settle down now, right? All right, let's take that down and never look at that again. These cakes, here's why we're talking about them. Because they become a little bit of a snapshot, a little bit of a time capsule into what we're in at any given moment. They tell us a little bit, and they freeze in time a little bit about who we are at a particular stage in our life. And so we can look at photos of cakes. Maybe you do this in your own life, or with, if you've got kids, look at photos of your kids' cakes, and you can remember like, oh, well, there's 6 candles on the cake, so they were 6, and it's a chocolate cake, that's what they liked. But also, it tells you something. A cake tells a story. This is what they were all about. Wedding cakes tell a story. This is what the couple prizes. Retirement cakes tell a story. This is what a person did with their life. Cakes tell a story, and they help us think back, but they also help us enter into that moment. Sometimes we'll have just a slice of cake or just a bite of cake, And it'll help us remember and kind of relive an experience of another time we've had that bite of cake. Flavor and memory are closely tied. Cakes become time capsules, and they help us enter back into our story at different points. So as Christians, we don't always celebrate with cake, but we have kind of the same time capsule effect. It's not with cake, but it's with this thing that's called communion. And it's a special meal that helps us enter into a special point in our Christian story. It helps us remember who we are and what we're all about and where we come from, but it also helps us remember our hopes for the future. It helps us remember who God made us to be. And we're going to talk about communion a little bit today because the reality is, I think for most of us, communion is something that's kind of easy to do without thinking about. Like most of us have either partaken of communion before, we've seen communion, like we have some frame of reference for communion. Me personally, I grew up in a church, and so I've taken communion probably, a couple hundred times. But there have been a lot of times that it's been just kind of autopilot. You walk down the aisle and you get the bread and you get the juice and you take it. It's like, all right, check. Now I can go on to the next thing, right? There's been times that I haven't thought deeply about what it is I'm doing. Maybe you're better than me, but I think for a lot of us, it's easier to get on autopilot. So we're going to look at what is it that communion tells us? What does communion put us back into the story for? What's the point? Now, let's start with some basics. Because you probably know a few things about communion, and so I'll get us all on the same stage. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. So some of us grew up in the Methodist church, and we call this meal communion or Holy Communion. Some people grew up in other church traditions, and sometimes this goes by the name the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, Love Feast, or the Divine Liturgy. There's lots of names for this meal, but you'll find that most Christians, just about anywhere you go on the earth, they do this meal. Now, it looks a little different. We use little slices or little tears of Hawaiian bread, and we dip it into the juice. Sometimes people will eat bigger meals. Sometimes they'll use different types of bread. There's all these different traditions, but the one thing that unites, or one of the things that unites almost all Christians, is that they get together sometime and they have communion. Now, maybe you grew up in a church tradition that had communion. Maybe you didn't grow up in a church tradition at all, and that's fine. What we believe about communion is it's this thing that we call a sacrament. And a sacrament is any ordinary thing that has been given an extraordinary, and in this case, a holy meaning. So we have lots of sacraments in our life, whether we think about it or not. This is a sacrament. It's a wedding ring. I mean, at face value, it's just a little bit of metal that's been folded or formed into a ring. By itself, this isn't worth much, but to me, it means a lot. Because to me, this is a symbol of Melissa and I's relationship. Right? This is a wedding ring. It's an ordinary piece of metal that's been given extraordinary significance. Some of you have sacraments and ordinary things that are relics of people you love. For couples that lose family members, for people that lose parents, sometimes it's a cherished belonging of the one you lost that becomes that sacrament, that reminder of who they were. It might have been a simple thing, a shoe or an article of clothing, something that didn't mean much at the time, but now it reminds you of them. It's a sacrament, an ordinary thing given a holy purpose. At Melissa and I's house, we have this massive cutting board on our kitchen counter. It's way bigger than what we need. It's big enough that you could carve like 2 whole turkeys on it. We don't eat 2 whole turkeys that often, though I think we should do that more often for a normal meal. But we have this massive cutting board on our counter because this cutting board matters to me. It's something that my great-grandfather built by hand before he had power tools, and I didn't really get to know him very well. But it reminds me of the stories I've heard about him when I look at it. It's this really cool cutting board that he built, and to me, it's taken on meaning beyond just what its use is as an object. In the United Methodist Church, we have 2 sacraments. One is baptism, and we baptize babies, and we baptize adults, and we use this moment to remind people that God claims us as his own. We take water, and it becomes a symbol as we enter into God's presence and God's grace. As God is washing us, that simple water becomes a sacrament. The other one is communion. And in communion, we have bread and juice, but they help us enter into the story of Jesus. They help us not just remember up here, not just learn something about, but instead they help us walk into the story, to imagine the story, to experience the story. When we celebrate Holy Communion, it would have been a lot easier if we could just like have little packets of communion ready to go for all of you at your seat. You know, a little like container of juice and a little piece of bread. That'd be faster logistically. Or maybe when you walk in, right? Like it seems weird, right? Like you walk in and the greeter just like hands you, here's your communion kit, just go ahead and sit down. Like that would be faster than walking down the aisle. But there's a reason we don't do that. Every single time we take communion, we tear open a loaf and we hold up the juice so that you can help remember that this is part of a story. It's not just the artifacts themselves. This is you entering into the story. And so with that, I want you to enter into the story today. I wonder if you'll indulge me a little bit. You can close your eyes if you want. You don't have to, but imagine this story with me. Because when we take communion, it takes us back to an upper room 2,000 years ago. And Jesus looks out and he sees his disciples, his closest friends. They followed him for years. He sees the faces of the men who have followed him. And he prays for them and he blesses them. Even though he knows that one of them is going to betray him and one of them is going to deny him and the rest are going to forsake him. He prays for them. Feel the feeling of the bread in your mouth. The taste of the loaf that Jesus held up and broke and said, this is my body. This is broken for you. This is the depths of my love for you. Feel the juice, the wine as it hits your lips. As Jesus said, this is my blood of the new covenant. Shocking words. Words meant to catch our attention. This is what we're called to walk back into. This is the story that communion invites us to join back into. It's tactile. We can not only touch it, but we can enter into it. The first thing I want you to know about Holy Communion is that it's a means of grace because it helps us experience this story. By itself, it's nothing. By itself, it's just bread and juice. But when we walk back into this story, we begin to wrap ourselves in the grace of this moment. Now, we've been talking about this moment for about a month now, and we're going to talk about it through Easter, this particular story of the Last Supper. And we've talked in our sermon series about each of the different things on the communion table. We started with the table itself and how the table reminds us that once upon a time, somebody made room for us at the table to come and join in this story of God's grace. Once upon a time, somebody did something. Maybe they sacrificed heavily. Maybe they just invited us. But once upon a time, somebody made sure we had a seat at the table. And so it's our duty now to make sure that somebody else has a seat at the table. And then we talked about the basin of water. And we remember that Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. And there was some shame there. And we remember that sometimes we feel shame, but that Jesus washes us clean. And that in the face of Jesus, there is no room for shame. We talked about the candles and how the candles invite us not just to see the people around us as we normally do, not like unthinking, but instead to see the people around us in the light of God's grace. We talked about the tablecloth and how the tablecloth reminds us that there are seasons to the life of God, that there's a cadence and a rhythm. That just like every area of our life where we go through different seasons, that in our faith there are different seasons. And right now we're in Lent, and we're in the season where many of us are willing to sacrifice in order to grow closer to God. We've been talking about these artifacts for about a month. We're going to talk about the plate next week, and tonight or today we're going to talk about the cup. Now, there's some things about the cup that matter. We're looking at them because Jesus takes this cup and helps us understand it in a new meaning. He helps us use it to enter into the story. And so with that, I want to read the story again. This is the story Melissa read, the story that goes like this in Luke 22. After taking a cup and giving thanks, he, Jesus, said, "Take this and share it amongst yourselves. I tell you, from now on, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine until God's kingdom has come." And then taking the bread and giving thanks, he broke it. And he said to them, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then he took the cup. And after the meal, he said, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood, poured out for you." These were shocking words. See, there were words you were supposed to say at this point in the meal, and these were not them. Jesus is sitting down to a meal with his friends, and you might remember this if you've been here the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about it, but Jesus is sitting down to a meal called Passover. And it was a big holiday for him and all of his disciples. They were Jewish people, and they would remember this big Jewish holiday. Passover was the story of Moses, where the Jewish people would remember that once upon a time they were slaves. And they cried out to God in their slavery, and God heard them, and God rescued them. And God brought them out of slavery and into the promised land. And this becomes their story. The story that they were the people who God heard when they cried, and God rescued because God cared. This is the story of Passover that they're there to remember, not the breaking of a body or the spilling of blood. Every year they would celebrate this meal. And like a cake takes us back to a happy moment, this meal would take them back to their moment. They would start out the night experiencing their slavery and walk the path that God used to take them to freedom. Now, I think in the time that Jesus and his disciples share it, this meal must have taken on a special purpose. See, they were no longer slaves to the Egyptian pharaohs, but they felt just as much of a need for freedom. When Jesus and his disciples sit down for a meal, they're living in what we might best describe as occupied territory. It's no longer Pharaoh who makes the rules, but these young Jewish men have to look up, and every time they walk down the street, they see armed Roman guards standing there, reminding them that their country, Judea, has been conquered by Rome. And that though they're not slaves, they're pretty close to it. Every time they kneel down at the temple to pray, they look up, and on one side there is the temple, and right outside of the corner of their vision, there's the Anatolia fortress. Roman battle standards looking down on them even as they kneel to pray. And I wonder if in that moment, Passover begins to take on a new meaning. As they hear the story of God rescuing people from slavery, and they look around at what feels like their own captivity, and they ask, hey, God, can you do that again? God, do you still rescue people today? God, will it always be like this? There was a longing for freedom and justice. That longing spoke to one of the purposes of Passover, that physical liberation. But the thing about Passover is that wasn't the extent of Passover. See, Passover has a number of different meanings. They're represented in these 4 different cups of wine that are drank throughout the course of the night. 4 small cups of wine drank throughout the course of the Passover celebration. And each one of these cups has a different purpose. It's one of these cups that Jesus probably lifted when he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant." Each of these has a meaning, taken from the 6th chapter of Exodus, when God says 4 different I will statements. The first is deliverance. And God says, I will take you out of Egypt. And the first cup was a reminder to these people who lived in what felt like their own Egypt that God hears us when we cry out from our brokenness. That even when it feels like we're slaves in our own country, or sometimes for us in our own lives, even when it feels like we're broken and people are just treading on us, even when it feels like we are in the depths of despair, we remember that God hears people there. That even when it feels like we've got nothing and no one cares about us, we remember that once upon a time, God listened to people who had nothing and no one cared for them. The first cup is the cup that says, I will take you out of Egypt. The second cup was I will deliver you from bondage. It was a reminder that God breaks us free from the stuff that enslaves us. For the ancient Hebrews, that was Egypt. For the ancient Jews in the first century, that was Rome that they cried out for escape. Well, for us, it's not normally an outward persecution, but normally it's the stuff inside of us. See, I think we all have stuff that sometimes puts us into bondage, habits that we can't kick, addictions that take over our lives, stuff that becomes so much of a part of it that we can't break free from it. Last week we talked about Lent and how Lent is the season sometimes of giving stuff up to look and pay attention to our habits, to see if we've got things that take over our life without our knowing. The second cup reminds us that God delivers us from bondage like that. The third cup was the cup of I will redeem you. It's a reminder that sometimes we get ourselves into bad spots and places we can't get ourselves out of. Sometimes we do stuff that's pretty messed up, and the theological term for that is sin. And God sees that. Instead of turning his back, God looks and goes, I still love you, and I will redeem you. That even when we've made mistakes, that God still cares for us. And the final cup, the fourth cup, is I will call you my own. And sometimes we go through life and we try to do our own stuff because we think we'll always be alone. And it's worth remembering that God says, I call you and I claim you before your first breath. You are my people, and I love you, and I care for you. Some of us need to experience one of those four cups. Actually, if we're honest, I think all of us need each of those cups. This is part of what we enter back into every time we take communion. Part of what we walk back into, part of the story that we not just remember, but experience. God offering four different cups of redemption to us. These cups are the answer to the cry of the Jews when they asked, will it always be like this? And they're the answer for us when we struggle with our struggles. Excuse me. But there was one more cup. There was one more cup that we haven't talked about yet. See, there were four cups of what God had done and four memories of where God had been, but there was one more cup that wasn't drunk. And it worked like this. At Passovers in the ancient world, and you'll still see this in many celebrations of Passover today, the head of the household will pour a cup full of wine and will sit it in an empty seat at the table. And then the kids in the house will run to the front door and throw the front doors open, and they'll look, expecting, hoping. This fifth cup is what's called the cup of Elijah. And it's a cup that is supposed to be an offering to the 9th century prophet who spoke about justice and mercy, the one who spoke powerfully and boldly about truth. This fifth cup is a reminder that God's done a lot to redeem our world, but there are places where that story is not done yet. There are places where we're still longing for mercy and justice. There are places where we're still longing for hope. The cup of Elijah is supposed to focus our hearts and our lives on justice, to not just hope for, but to live out. The call to speak truth even when we're scared. It's a call to look not just for our own salvation, but the salvation of those around us. And I think sometimes when I talk about this in church, I kind of get to like wishy-washy mild stuff. And it's like, let's be a little nicer to those around us. Let's not say mean things. And that is true, and you should not say mean things. But when we talk about justice, sometimes justice is a really big issue. And so I wanted to give you a picture of what justice looks like, something that something that came up on the news in a powerful way this week. This is a man named Mike Sharp. Mike is a Kansas boy. He's from Heston. Anybody ever been to Heston before? It's just north of Wichita. It's a little smaller than Tonganoxie. It's a town of, 4,000 people. Mike's from Heston, but he's not actually in Heston in this picture. This picture is taken in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he's in a camp for some of the locals. So Mike's got kind of an interesting job. He works he worked with the Congolese Protestant churches, later for the UN, but he works in the volatile parts of Congo that are inhabited or infested by freedom fighters, or we might call them rebels, who were part of the Rwandan genocide and were pushed out of Rwanda in the midst of the genocide by the army and have now taken up habitation in the jungles of Congo, waiting to go back and finish what started 20 years ago. They're waiting to go back and finish a genocide that took the lives of some 5 million people. And for 20 years, these rebels have lived in huts and tents in the forest. They built camps and lives, and they're just sitting there waiting to go back. And that's a weird longing. Because on one side, we all understand the longing to go home. But on the other side, their desire is genocide. And so Mike walks into the jungle, and his job is to find these camps. And when he finds one, his job is not to wipe it out. His job is to walk up to the front and to sit down in the shade of a banana tree. And there Mike will sit, and he's pretty unassuming. He's pretty non-threatening looking. And he'll sit in his sandals and jeans, and people will come up and they'll talk. He'll drink tea with them. And they'll share stories. And there are some things that he can't talk about, some things that just curl your stomach, as this is a place that has known genocide for 20 years. But then he'll talk with these warlords. And little by little, his job is to talk to them about home and to try to kindle within them a longing for justice. He does this out of a hope, out of a belief that God's work is not done yet. His job is to talk people into going back home, not to kill, but instead to build homes, to talk violent rebels into leaving the jungle. He's been doing this for 10 years. And over the past 10 years, he and a few friends have talked 1,600 different rebels into going back home and building farms and schools and lives. Without firing a shot, he and his friends have wiped out 1/4 of the genocidal rebels that perpetuated the Rwandan genocide. That's a powerful picture of justice. Now, some of you know this because you heard it on the news this last week. Earlier this month, Mike and a coworker went missing. And he and his family have known forever that what he does is dangerous. And when you try to talk genocidal warlords into leaving their occupation, things can get tough. They found a shallow grave with the remains of a Caucasian man and a Caucasian woman last week. And since there were no other white people in the area, his family started to fear the worst. It appears that he's not only devoted his life, but eventually lost it, giving the last full measure of his resolve to a cause and a belief that was unshakable within him. Not some mild hope that justice might make the world a little nicer, but instead that they might be able to talk genocidal warriors out of the jungle and back to home. 1,600 people left war because of that belief. And though it cost him his life, it had been his life's ambition to bring justice, to see life and light push back the darkness. Sometimes justice costs us. The cup of Elijah, this fifth cup, is different from the last four. They remember what God has done, the places God has brought redemption for us. This fifth one reminds us not just of what yet God is to do, but where we are called and invited to partner along the way. They remind us God is still on the move. They answer for us the question, will it always be like this? And they proclaim powerfully that God is not done yet. So which cup did Jesus hold up? Was it the cup of rescue that God hears us in our brokenness? Was it the cup of deliverance that God frees us from the things that entangle us? Was it the cup of redemption and that God forgives us? Was it the cup of calling and that God claims us? Was it the cup of Elijah? That God has a hope for the places that don't feel hope yet. The truth is we don't know. Scholars debate it. I'll let you pursue their own theories on your own. But the truth is, I think also, that each of these meanings is present when we take communion. That every single time we take communion, we find a powerful experience of all of these five cups, what God has done and what God is yet to do. Every time we enter into communion, we enter back into the story, and we remember rescue and deliverance, redemption and claiming, and we remember and recommit that God is not done yet.